in the video world as well, especially music videos. So just, again, to go over some of the impact of self-objectification. We picture ourselves being looked at. We begin this process of third-person living when we're really young. And massive media exposure helps us develop a standard against which we are measuring ourselves. Some people self-objectify way too much. They're self-objectifying in their mind, in their imagination, and the evaluation that they are giving themselves is often and usually negative. We know now from research that our brains are trained to break women into sexual parts, to perceive women as broken into sexual body parts. We also know from another string of research that if you even remind women of the way in which they are sexually objectified, show a picture of women dressed like some of these marketing advertisements, and you give them a math test before and after exposure to those images, just the exposure to the negative stereotype causes them to do worse on the math test. So seeing yourself as a person like in these images or wanting to aspire to this actually hurts women's performance on academic tasks. Yes?
Has there been any studies on, exposing women to normal body images and how that affects them before and after?
Yes, there have been comparisons in those exact studies where they'll compare women to images that suggest a negative stereotype, that women as sexually objectified, sort of looked down upon, used for men, and then compared the other condition, another condition, to women who do not look sexually objectified. There's no suggestion of it, and women perform better when they are given the condition where they see women just, dressed in sort of normal clothes. I think one of the conditions, they only went so far as to have like tight sweaters on, and that was enough to bring up the sexual objectification negative stereotype. So this is my own pictorial representation of this self-objectification process. I see myself through the eyes of the imagined receiver, and here's the audience that you're imagining in your mind. And I define myself as I think others will see me. Another problem with self-objectification is you can't see yourself other than as a self-objectified person. I'm going to give you an example of this in just a minute. I found a blog thread amongst men. It's a site called Good Men, and men who are trying to be responsible with this whole issue of sexual objectification, and we're talking about why do men sexually objectify women? What's the motivation? And here were a couple of the summary reasons. For guys who have very little ability to self-reflect or limited self-awareness, they live seeing the entire world as objects for their use, rather than seeing objects as relational interplay, people with whom they have relationships. And marketing plays to men and their disconnected selves. Now, there was a little more crass language actually in the comments and the blog was marketing appeals to men's animal selves, just kind of rugged, they use the word horny, like sexually motivated, just give me an object, whatever is easily at hand. Another one that I found really interesting was stress relief. Some of the men were saying that if they are feeling stressed, or there's something they don't want to deal with within themselves, it's kind of like a cheap thrill. It's almost the same reason that men might go to pornography. Looking at advertisements of women chopped up into parts looking very vulnerable. So here's my example of what happens when a woman over self-objectifies. So you've been living life in the third person a lot. Your view of yourself yourself is almost always defined by what you think other people are thinking of you. You get married. Or you get in a permanent relationship, and now you're expected to be, well, you want yourself, I shouldn't say expected, you want yourself to be intimate sexually with your partner. But here comes the self-objectification. I imagine myself being sexual as if somebody were watching me be sexual. Am I being good sexual? Am I being like the women in the pornography? Am I like being like the women in the advertisement? So where I am truly to be able to give to my partner is not there. What's there is a big sense of self that is garnered from the media. That's too much self-objectification. It's really bordering on, if not dissociative. So disconnected from yourself that you can't be there with your partner because you're on stage at all times. I carried this over into eating. I don't know that anybody else has actually suggested this, but I think we objectify the way we eat, our eating selves. So these are some examples. There were many, many advertisements like this. You see women watching their waistline here. And look what they're eating. They're eating fruit, and other pictures are of salad. So we have an objectified sense of how we're supposed to eat. We see ourselves and we think other people are seeing us eating. We self-objectify ourselves when we eat. So I go into the cafeteria, I sit down, and I have my meal, and maybe you're struggling with an eating disorder, and you're having to eat in a certain way in order to work toward recovery. Maybe you're aware of how you think other people are going to see your food. And maybe this is the ideal standard. So if I have a pile of macaroni and cheese on my plate, does it look like this? And maybe I start evaluating my eating self in a negative way because you're self-objectifying. Here's another one of those idealized self-eating pictures. Seeing you, seeing me, eating. Disconnected from who we are as people. What our real appetites are, what our cravings are. Obviously, if you're well into an eating disorder, presents an eating disorder, you may be disconnected from your hunger and cravings anyway. But assuming that's not the case, there is an answer to the food to eat. And that is what you're hungry for, what your body is craving, what your personal wants and needs are, not what you think you ought to be eating. So the more we self-objectify, the more disconnected we get from our own bodies, and that includes hunger, satiety, our own body cues, even our emotions. Except, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to point this out, because this is important. In the case of anorexia, a lot of what I said does not apply, because there is brain impairment, we know now, in the case of anorexia. And the whole reward circuit in the brain is dysregulated for people with anorexia. So I can't talk about mindful eating. I can't talk about connecting with self and finding what your real appetites are if a person is in the anorexia process, in the illness, because it's not possible for them to get those cues. They're just not available until the body is restored, until a little bit further on in recovery. We know from Neil Kim's talk that sometimes even when a person is nutrition restored, they don't always get those hunger cues back. They don't always get those satiety cues back. They don't always get the taste for food back. But if they did in recovery, all of what I'm saying would be true. So I just wanted to point out that that's one exception here. Normal people, when they're hungry, cannot resist the cues from within to eat. Your brain is on a search and find mission. As soon as those little inklings of hunger begin to show themselves, even on research has shown on a subconscious or unconscious level, you're starting to tune into where's the food, where's the food, where's the food. That's not happening for somebody with anorexia. So here's some ideas about how to avoid over self-objectifying and developing a negative body image, which, by the way, we know is a precursor to eating disorders in many, many cases. Tuning into your body, checking in with your cravings. What does your body want? When it comes to eating, turn off the self-surveyor and ask yourself not what should I be eating, but what do I want to eat? What am I hungry for? How hungry am I? And I'm guessing that some of the topics that you've covered in here about healthful eating and talked about checking in with your hunger. I just covered point number 3 here. Check in with your emotions. Another disconnect for people with eating disorders and people who over self-objectify is emotional disconnect. So how can you check in with your emotions? Just ask yourself, what do I feel? What am I feeling right now? What did I feel today? Or I'll borrow an exercise from dialectical behavior therapy. Today, what was the most emotionally impactful event that occurred to me? You got really scared as you went into a test, and then you felt relief when you came out of it, whatever it might be. And check in with that emotion, rate that emotion, understand what function that emotion served. That's all part of the mindful process of reconnecting with our bodies. Mirror checking. Boy, mirror checking and body pinching, really common, as most of you probably know, with people who are self-surveying and being self-critical about body. If there are actual behaviors like that, like getting on the scale several times a day, get a baseline for where that is and start to reduce the number of times that there's mirror checking, body pinching, scale jumping, etc. Rome wasn't built in a day. If there's a lot of that going on because of that body shame and self-surveying, you can start where you are and just gradually peel that back. Work on body comparison. So I think being mindfully aware when there's a tendency to body compare to other women is very helpful. Where's your head going when you're walking down the street, when you walk into a room? Is the first thing that happens, where is my body size and shape relative to other people? If it's become a mind habit, it's going to be there for a while, but at least you can become aware. That's the first step to change. And then gradually work on reducing the amount that's going on. So that is it. I am open for questions, discussion. Yeah?
You said over objectifying a lot. Do you think that some level of objectification and self-objectification is unavoidable?
Is unavoidable? Yeah, there's, like I was saying, I think self-objectification is just a normal human developmental process. And we all need to be able to do it. We have to be able to gauge how we look to other people in order to navigate our social environment, especially. Even to develop a self-concept. What are our constellations of beliefs about ourselves? Well, maybe some of it is coming from how we see other people seeing us. So it's when you start tipping the balance toward too much self-surveillance, when you lose yourself, and that's mostly what you're doing, is seeing yourself in the mirror of somebody else's eyes, in the male gaze, and in the case of sexual objectification. Is that? Yeah.
What do these behaviors generally start? Is it like adolescence, or like does it start earlier? Have you seen really, really young cases of this, or?
Yes, I'm shaking my head. Yes, yes, yes. Very young. Let's see. The youngest person I worked with was a bona fide. Went to the hospital. Issue with anorexia was 8 or 9. So definitely. There's some research, interesting research, that looked at negative body image fifth graders, and then they follow those fifth graders into sixth grade. And they try to say, did you happen to see that? Okay, yeah, so they looked at the girls who were most negative about their body images in fifth grade, the most self-conscious about their bodies, and then they followed them into sixth grade, and from fifth grade to sixth grade, of course, we're in those puberty years, which are like fertilizer for eating disorders. In that year, the girls who were most negative about their bodies in fifth grade, by the time that they got to sixth grade, they were the most likely to develop early eating disturbances, pathologies. Pretty good predictor. So yeah, starts really young. We've all heard the stories. Jenny Schaefer talks about it, being negative about your body at 4 or 5 years old. The typical comment that I hear about is a 4 or 5-year-old coming home from school and saying, "Mommy, my stomach is fat. My stomach is too big," or "Is my stomach too big?" And then feeling like they ought to do something about that. So it starts with a negative self-concept and body shame, very young.
How do you how do you respond as a parent to something like a comment like that? Or another comment from maybe like another kid or a friend? How do you respond to that?
Most parents, when they're telling me this, they've made it to my office, so things have gotten, to a pretty negative place. So some of the parents that get those general comments, I don't get to hear how they handle it, but the ones that get to the place where they've already got eating disorder pathologies and get to my office, the typical parent response to that is, and this is not wrong, "You're fine just the way you are. You are beautiful. I love you just the way you are. I'm uncomfortable when you say negative things about your body." One of the problems with just saying that with parents is that it cuts off the conversation, because that's a parent platitude, right? If you love your child, you're going to say you're fine the way you are. You're not going to say, "Oh yeah, we'll take you to a nutritionist so you can lose weight." Especially with all of the recovery literature and media attention there's been about preventing eating disorders, it's been somewhat effective. So parents will say, the wrong thing. But I think you have to stop. I think it's good for parents to stop and say, well, what makes you think that your stomach is large? And just try to get a little more information about where they're coming from so you can get inside of their psychology and then work with that. The other thing, of course, that comes to mind is it's so important for moms and big sisters and adults in the house not to diss their own bodies. Not to say, "Oh, I ate that piece of pizza, now I got to run a mile, or I'm going to have to go to the gym because I ate all that birthday cake." All those common eating disordered, normalized eating disordered comments that get made. And I think that parents who have children who are hearing those kind of comments really start to pay attention to, I'm not going to diss my own body, I'm not going to have bulimic talk in my house about you eat, you have to get rid of it. Does that help? Yes?
I guess one question I have is, so in certain races and communities, there is a different ideal or a more full-figured ideal, and do you see that same trend of self-objectification,
Yep.
but just to a different standard?
Yes, I think that's very true. Interestingly, I'll just talk about African American women for a minute. African American women have higher self-esteem on the average than white women, including body esteem. But yes, there are different cultural standards for what an idealized body looks like. And whatever that is, if it gets too internalized and you over self-objectify, the same sorts of issues come about. It still becomes a kind of body shame.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Other questions?
But what about like the light skin? You know about like the light skin and dark skin thing?
No, but tell me about it and I'll respond.
Well, I don't know if that was what you were referring to, but like, and like
called a color struck, right?
Yeah, it's still like that. Like if you watch like rap videos, like all of the females are like biracial or like gender compression.
Yep.
So
Yes.
it was kind of interesting that you said like African American women have like
Higher self-esteem from Caucasian women on the average. I just know that from teaching my psychology class. But yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because if you look at African American couples, you'll see that the man is the darker one,
Yeah.
and the woman is always like, what is that about?
I don't know, like my parents are like that too. Like,
Yeah?
it's like standard. I don't know what that is.
Like if you should marry somebody who's a little bit later than you are.
Status symbol.
Well, happily, my sons are biracial, and one of my sons married a woman who's several shades darker than he is. Beautiful woman. Other